that killed lesser men. He has stood shoulder to shoulder in a wall of shields and felt enemy cavalry shatter against it like waves breaking on rock. This man does not know fear. And yet here, with nothing before him but the open sea, watching the water crawl toward his feet and slide back again, and again, slow and patient and somehow alive. His stomach turns to ice, his hands begin to shake, and he cannot say why. Now hold that image, because that trembling farmer is about to conquer the world. This is the paradox buried at the very heart of the greatest empire history has ever known. The people whose legions would crush every army sent against them, who would carve their name into 3 continents, once stood paralyzed before a single wave. We remember Rome as eternal, invincible, colossal. But we have forgotten how it began. Because before Rome ruled the sea, Rome was terrified of it. In the 3rd century before Christ, there were no Roman sailors. There were farmers, soldiers, men of dust and iron who trusted only the solid ground beneath their boots. To them, the sea was not a road to glory. It was a living enemy, a black and shifting void, and their imaginations filled that darkness with monsters, with Scylla and Charybdis lurking beneath the surface, waiting to drag entire ships down into silence. They built the straightest, strongest roads the world had ever seen, out of stone, because stone did not betray you. Stone did not move. But the sea moved. The sea could swallow a man and leave nothing behind. And so, an invisible wall closed around the edges of their world. And just beyond it, out on that forbidden water, their enemies sailed free, laughing, untouchable. Then history did what history always does. It reached straight for the one thing they feared the most, and it made a demand that could not be refused. Master the sea, or be devoured by it. There was no third choice. What you are about to hear is the story of how a nation of terrified landsmen answered that impossible demand. And at the center of it sits one crude, ugly, almost laughable invention, hammered together out of nothing but desperation, that would flip the most powerful navy on Earth onto its back and rewrite the rules of war forever. Hold on to that invention. Everything turns on it. And hold on to one more thing before we begin, because by the end, it will mean far more than it does right now. The very thing a people fears the most is so often the doorway to their greatest becoming. It began, as these things so often do, over a single island, Sicily, a sun-baked stretch of land, sitting in the narrow waters between 2 rising powers, rich with grain and harbors and ambition, and both Rome and Carthage wanted it for themselves. So the armies came, and on the soil of Sicily, the Roman legions did what they had always done. They advanced. They dug their camps. They took city after city, grinding forward with that cold, relentless discipline that made them the terror of the ancient world. On land, they were winning, and it meant nothing. Because every time the legion surrounded a Carthaginian stronghold and tightened the noose, they would look out to the horizon and see the sails. Carthaginian ships, gliding in untouched, carrying fresh soldiers, fresh weapons, fresh bread, pouring life back into a city Rome had nearly starved. The siege would collapse, the work would begin again, and there was nothing, the greatest infantry on Earth could do about it, because the road that fed their enemy was made of water, and the water belonged to Carthage. Imagine that helplessness. To win every battle and still be losing the war. And it was worse than helplessness. It was humiliation. Because while the legions bled in Sicily, Carthaginian raiders sailed up the coast of Italy itself, burning fishing towns, dragging Roman citizens off in chains to be sold as slaves, choking the grain routes that fed the city. A proud people were being robbed on their own doorstep, and they could not reach the thief. So the Senate made a decision so reckless, it bordered on madness. If Carthage owned the sea, then Rome would build a fleet and take it from them. A nation that feared the water would go to war upon it. There was only one problem. They had never built a warship in their lives. So how do you build a thing you have never even seen? And then, as if history itself had decided to take a side, fate handed Rome a gift. During one of the raids along the Italian coast, a storm caught a Carthaginian warship and flung it onto the shore, and there it lay, cracked open on the sand, but nearly whole. One of the most advanced war machines of the age, delivered into Roman hands by the very sea they feared. To Carthage, it was a lost ship. To Rome, it was a blueprint. The finest carpenters and engineers in the Republic descended on that wreck and took it apart plank by plank, measuring every joint, studying every curve of the hull, learning the secret language of the enemy's craft, because this was the Roman genius in its purest form. They were not dreamers who invented from nothing. They were something more dangerous. They were the greatest borrowers the world has ever known. Men who could take another people's masterpiece, tear it down to its bones, and build it back stronger. And build they did. What happened next should have been impossible. In roughly 2 months, a nation that had never made a warship launched a fleet of more than 100 of them. An entire country became a single furnace of labor. Forests followed, hammers ringing from dawn to dark. But ships are only wood without the men to move them. And here, Rome faced its deepest problem, because you cannot conjure sailors out of farmers. So they did something no one else would have thought to do. They practiced on dry land. All along the coast, they built wooden benches shaped like the decks of ships. And there, on solid ground, thousands of men who had never once seen the open sea sat in long rows and learned to row against the empty air, pulling in unison to the beat of a hammer and the cry of a flute until the motion lived in their muscles. It was strange. It was almost comical. And it was pure Rome. That iron patience, that refusal to be beaten by what they didn't yet know. The ships were ready. The men were ready. And still, against the masters of the sea, it was not enough. Something was missing. One final piece. That missing piece was the invention I told you to remember. And it was so simple, so crude, that at first glance you would laugh at it. It was a bridge, a heavy wooden gangway around 36 feet long, mounted on the bow of a Roman ship, and beneath its far end hung a single massive iron spike, curved and cruel, shaped like the beak of a bird. The Romans called it the Corvus, the raven, and here was the terrible beauty of it. A Carthaginian ship would close in for the kill, trusting its speed, trusting centuries of skill, and at the last moment, the raven would drop. That iron beak would smash down through the enemy's deck and bite deep into the wood. And in an instant, the two ships were locked together, nailed as one, and everything the Carthaginians were best at, the darting, the circling, the ramming, all of it turned to ash. Because now there was a bridge, and across that bridge came the legionaries. Do you see the genius of it? Rome could not beat Carthage at sea, so Rome refused to fight at sea at all. They dragged the battle onto their own ground. They took the one thing on earth no one could do better than they could. The disciplined swordsman standing shoulder to shoulder with his brothers, and they carried it out onto the water. At Mylae, in 260 before Christ, the Carthaginians sailed in laughing at the clumsy contraptions on the Roman prows, and that laughter died as the ravens fell and Roman steel poured onto their decks, and their proud fleet was torn apart. 4 years later, at Cape Ecnemus, in one of the largest sea battles the ancient world would ever witness, it happened again, on a colossal scale. The farmers who had trembled at the shore were now masters of it. But history loves a bitter twist, and here comes the cruelest one of all. That very invention, the raven that had saved Rome and humbled an empire, was about to turn on its own creators and become a curse that would swallow entire fleets whole. The curse was this: that heavy iron beak sat high on the bow, and it made the ships top-heavy, unstable, prone to rolling. In calm water, the raven was a weapon. In a storm, it was a death sentence. And storms came. Whole fleets, hundreds of ships, thousands of men went down not to Carthaginian swords, but to the sea itself, dragged under by the very device that had made them victorious. So Rome did the hardest thing a victorious people can ever do. They let it go. They abandoned the invention that had saved them, because they understood a truth most conquerors never learn. The tool that wins you one war can lose you the next. And instead of clinging to the past, they grew. They built ships larger and heavier than anything Carthage had ever floated, mounted towers on the decks, loaded them with catapults and bolt throwers, and became, at last, not lucky landsmen with a clever trick, but true masters of the sea. The proof came generations later, when pirates infested the Mediterranean and choked the grain that fed Rome. A general named Pompey carved the entire sea into 13 zones and swept them clean, end to end, in roughly 3 months. 3 months to master the water their ancestors had trembled before. And so they gave that sea a name. Not the sea. Not a sea. Mare Nostrum. Our sea. Think of how far that word had traveled, from a farmer shaking at the edge of a single wave, to a people who looked across the whole vast Mediterranean and called it theirs. Because no one is born a master of the ocean. Rome was not chosen by the water. Rome chose to conquer it, and turned the very thing it feared most into the foundation of an empire. That is the lesson buried in the waves. Our greatest weakness, faced without flinching, can become the ground we build our future on. So let me leave you with this. What is the sea you are still afraid of? Tell me below. And if this story stirred something in you, stay with us, subscribe, and let's keep uncovering the moments that quietly change the world.
Note the difference in the keel joint.